Alrighty, we are back with another episode in our series on American history. And this time, this era is sometimes referred to as the era of good feelings and new technology. There is a lot of moves forward during this time period. We're going to talk about the early to mid 1800s. If you are watching this without having watched the previous episode, I am recording this at the same time as the one about the War of 1812 and Thomas Jefferson's presidency. So if there are mic problems in that one, I don't know it yet, and I haven't fixed it yet, so I apologize. However, that's out of the way. Let's get after it. So, money talks. The War of 1812 is over. And in the aftermath, both sides realize that there's kind of no point to being mad at each other because everybody's losing money this way. So Britain, finally, like their not-so-friends, the French, are taking steps to smooth out relations with the Americans. And Britain is going to remain and continue to be for a very long time a buyer of American raw materials. If you remember way back to the very first episode, kind of the whole point of colonies, at least in the beginning, were to basically exploit their natural resources. And Britain is still kind of doing this, but now we're getting paid for it. And the U.S., while expanding its industry and its manufacturing power, is definitely not on the level of the UK yet, so we're going to remain buyers of their manufactured goods for a long time. We haven't had our Industrial Revolution yet, though it is coming. Now, between 1815 roughly and 1817 roughly, we are going to solve a lot of our disputes peacefully. A lot of the stuff that was creeping up before and during and just after the War of 1812 is going to get smoothed out right here. One of them is solved in what is called the Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817. It is the first mutual naval disarmament in history that we know of. Thank you, Lindsay Nicole. If you guys get that reference, big fan, go check her out. So what's going on here? The US and the UK basically come together and they're like, we are going to demilitarize the Great Lakes. The only military ships that are going to be left there is simply what is needed to combat the smuggling, mostly by the Dutch, that's going on there. And that isn't really that prevalent at this time anyways. And our entire 3,000-mile border with Canada is going to be demilitarized. This is a big deal. It's going to free up a lot of resources and money to be spent elsewhere by both countries. And this allows the conditions to be right for another agreement called the Convention of 1818. Basically, it's a free, open waters free fishing agreement. And this is a big deal. A lot of the American Northeast, a lot of New Englanders are going to be allowed to fish in Canadian waters, and that's going to allow their economies to grow as well. Things are going to be a lot easier, a lot more fishing grounds to be had. It's going to allow that industry to grow as well. It's a fairly big deal. This also sets the northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. So when Thomas Jefferson bought that land from Napoleon, there was no official border. There was an implied border that it stopped where the Northwest Ordinance did. But you got to remember, there's 3 countries worth of people in there trying to vie their own pieces of land, and this just irons that out in an official capacity. So we finally get our northern border with Canada, and it's going to almost entirely stay that way up until today. A few small changes in a couple of states, but that's it really. And what this also allows for is this thing called, they term it a joint occupation of the Oregon Territory. So on this map here, if you look northwest, that green area, that is the Oregon Territory. This is a later map, so don't look at it too much. There's a little spoilers if you don't know what's going on. But that's the territory that both British and American troops and civilians are allowed to be in and use as they see fit moving forward until an unspecified date that is definitely totally not on that map. Moving forward, Florida, we got some issues. If you remember in the treaty that ended the American Revolution, Florida was given back to Spain. And by the early mid-1800s, Spain is still in control of Florida. And it becomes this safe haven for a lot of American runaway slaves because they know that the U.S. government can't go there. The U.S. government has no authority to extradite them back. Another group of people that is going to exploit this area for the exact same reasons are a lot of Native Americans. Both American civilians and the military are pretty aggressively moving west, and they are trying Native American relations, to say the least. And a lot of natives don't want to deal with it, so they flee to a more neutral area, and that neutral area is Florida. And a lot of these combined peoples, slaves and Native Americans, they come together and form a group called the Seminoles. If you've ever heard of the Seminole Wars, that's where that comes from. We'll talk about those later. The issue that the United States has is that the Seminoles regularly send raiding parties into Georgia and mess with American citizens. American citizens aren't happy, people are getting hurt, the government gets involved. They send in the military the way that George Washington started sending in the military for the Whiskey Rebellion. This is going to be standard American practice for a very long time. And to Spain's chagrin, the might of the American military in this area at this specific time is very disadvantageous for them, to say the least. Spain can't or maybe doesn't want to do anything about it, so they just give Florida to the United States. This is the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, and this is how the United States acquires Florida. This also does set the western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. If you look here, it's just the edge of that purple area on this map here. Because keep in mind, this is all Spanish territory at this point. Remember, all of this bit of Texas and Arizona, California, Nevada, all that stuff, this is Spanish territory. So when we're worried about this over here, the treaty that settles this also settles this. Okay. This is just a little bit better map showing a couple of different things. We have the Oregon Territory, which is claimed by the U.S. and Britain. That red line is now the border between the United States and New Spain, soon to be Mexico, soon to be the United States. Moving forward, we have this thing called the Monroe Doctrine. And this is going to have to do with a lot of foreign policy. This is going to be some of the first hands-on American foreign policy. So in 1809, there's a couple of rebellion in Spain's colonies. And by 1824, all of them had declared independence. In the meantime, in the middle of all of those rebellions, there was a quadruple alliance, and there it is formed between Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain. And they are coming together because they are mad at the French taking after the United States. They have their revolution, they establish democracy, and those four monarchies at the time don't like the fact that people are voting, and they're worried basically that they're going to have their own revolutions and they're going to get thrown out of power. So they're suppressing the ideals of the French Revolution that it came from the American Revolution. And it's pretty successful. So much so that there is some talk among European leaders to do the same thing to the United States. Never comes to fruition, but that's how effective it is. They start talking about suppressing American ideals the same way they did with the French, which is kind of shitty. Anyways, the U.S. Sympathizes with a lot of these colonies. They see them as like little brothers. You know, we've been in this plight before. We know what it's like to feel overrun and oppressed. We know what it's like to declare your independence. We feel you, so we kind of support them. We don't like the fact that a lot of European powers are meddling in South America. You know, going back to, you know, those European leaders talking of taking similar actions to the United States, if they're thinking about taking those actions to the U.S., they are certainly thinking of taking those actions to these smaller, less developed, less militarily capable countries in Latin America and South America. So we developed the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, and basically it says that the U.S. is going to do anything and everything they can to stop Europe from messing with these little countries. We're going to take on this like big brother role and like stop picking on him, that kind of thing. That's how it goes on paper anyways. In reality, if there was any deterrence from interfering, but it's basically because of the British Navy. Another very long story that I don't want to go on a tangent, but the Brits are expelled from this Quadruple Alliance, and they start trading. You know, they have a very strong presence in the Caribbean, and then they also start trading with a lot of countries in South America. So if there was a deterrence, it wasn't really the United States' Monroe Doctrine. It was the fact that there was a very heavy British naval presence in the area. However, the United States gets credit for this, at least on paper, because, well, they said, this is our doctrine, this is what's going to happen, don't come over here or else. And then they didn't come over here. So it looks like we did a lot more than we did. But I'm not mad that we got credit for it. Another election. All right, the last one we talked about was Thomas Jefferson's. There were several in between. Not that I'm saying they're not important. We can talk about those later if you want to. But the next one that makes a lot of waves is the election of 1824. Again, comes down to two candidates. I'm sure you are shocked. One of them is Andrew Jackson, and the other one is John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams. And an interesting thing happens here. Jackson gets the majority of the popular vote. So the majority of people in the United States voted for him. However, the Electoral College, he did not have the majority of electoral votes. Nobody did. There was another member who kind of sucked up, a third-party member who sucked up some, and it worked out so that none of the three entrants had the majority of electoral votes. If you're familiar with the 12th Amendment, which you're probably not, because who is? Basically, it says that should this happen, the president is determined by the House of Representatives voting, and each state gets one vote. And Adams cleans house, basically because of Henry Clay, who is the Secretary of State. He sabotages Jackson. They're both Westerners, and he didn't like that, basically, long story short. And the divide, we talked about how things were divided before between the Federalists and the agrarians who supported Thomas Jefferson, who were called Democratic Republicans. There is now another split. There's a divide between Jeffersonians, those agricultural type people, and it's getting larger. And there's another split. So people who supported Adams and Clay were national Republicans. They wanted a strong government. They wanted to be able to use taxes to generate a lot of money for a lot of the things that people today associate with tax money going to. Roads, canals, infrastructure, stuff like that. The Jacksonians called themselves Democrats, and they favored a much less powerful government. This is where we see the people who we were called Republicans last time, who were actually the Democratic Republicans. This is them now calling themselves just Democrats. So again, this is the ancestor of our modern day Democrat Party. The National Republicans are still not today's Republican Party. They will not come about for a while. They're going to be founded basically as an abolitionist party before the Civil War. And we're getting there, we're just not there yet. This is not them, not the National Republicans. Keep that in mind. Not the same, not the same. We got a lot of technological advancements going on. Transportation, a really big deal in 1825. The Erie Canal is completed. Now we can ship and trade and transport between the U.S. and Canada significantly more easily. It's going to cost way less to get goods over there. That means more people are going to buy the goods. That means the economy is going to grow. It's good for everybody all around. Import, export, all the things. A couple decades before that, 1806 begins on an east-west highway called the National Road. It's going to stretch from Maryland to Illinois. This is going to get completed a few years later, but it's going to do all of the same things. It's going to make shipping easier. It's going to make products cheaper. It's going to provide jobs. It's going to do basically only good things for the economy. Good deal here. In 1807, people had been working on steam engines and steam boats for a while. A concept is built and it's proven in 1807. Several decades later, by 1850, so in just 43 years from the time that the concept is proven in person with a working prototype to a time where they are commonplace is just 4 decades. And I cannot stress to you how fast that is in this time period. We're going to move forward and talk about technological advancements, and the time periods in between them is going to get increasingly small, moving up to modern day. However, this is a very big deal, and for the time period, it happens very fast. And why it's important is it allows boats to travel upriver. They no longer have to go downriver and then out to the ocean and then back up and then downriver again. Now they can simply go up and down a river, and again, it's going to do all the same things that the Erie Canal and the National Road did. It's a massive, massive, massive deal. And the other thing in transportation that's happening right now is that steam engine is going to get put to use on land as well. In a train, railroads are being built all over the place. It begins about the same time, very early 1800s, 1800s, 1810s. By 1861, by the time that the Civil War starts, from the time that they began being built, 30,000 miles of track is going to be laid. And remember, the United States doesn't even have claim to the continent in its entirety, east to west, yet. So this is a really, really big deal. Advancements in technology as a whole. The telegraph, finished in 1844 by Samuel Morse. That's where Morse code comes from, if you didn't know that. This is the first time we have instant long-term communication. Letters and couriers are going to stay around for a very long time. However, this is the first time we are going to see them start to get phased out by the upper elites of society, and the military sort of will get there. Again, by the start of the Civil War, 50,000 miles of telegraph lines have been built, almost double railroads. The cotton gin, invented by a guy named Eli Whitney. Again, big overview, allows for the very fast processing of raw cotton. It allowed for production to be increased by 50 times if it was powered by a person. If it was powered by water, it increased production by 1,000 times. Now, Eli Whitney was not a bad guy. However, because of this invention, he gets a very bad rap. His thought process was, if he made it easier for this to happen, there would be, you didn't need as much labor, so there would be less of a demand for slaves. There would be less of a demand for any workforce to do this exact work. However, because of this invention, Eli Whitney is responsible for an increase in demand for slaves by 300%. This increase in efficiency showed plantation owners that they could make a lot more money, thousands of times more money, by increasing their workforce by tens of times. And slavery demand explodes during this time period. Another thing that Eli Whitney is responsible for is interchangeable parts. And in my opinion, this is the most important invention, certainly in American history. And, it's hard to argue for this. Hard not to argue for this, over anything else for human history. Maybe the wheel. Interchangeable parts, it cannot be overstated how important this is. The concept is basically how everything works today. Prior to the concept of interchangeable parts, if you had a product, I'm going to use a firearm because that is the example I have up on the screen. But if you had a firearm, if you were a firearm manufacturer, what you did was you made a barrel and a stock and a flintlock and a locks mechanism and a trigger. And you made all of these parts, and then you put the gun together, and now this gun is done. Put it on the rack, make another barrel, a stock, a trigger, a lock, that kind of thing. Everything was hand-fitted all the time. So if your rifle broke, if your trigger broke, if your lock broke, you couldn't go to the store and buy another lock and just put it in the gun and it would work. It's not, because everything is hand-fitted. There is no, accepted specification for these parts. Everything is done on a individual case-by-case basis. The idea of interchangeable parts is that every part is manufactured to a set of tolerances that are close enough that they can drop into any example. So, instead of making each gun piece by piece, putting it all together, and then starting the next one, what you would do is make 100 barrels and 100 triggers and 100 locks, and then you put them all together. And regardless of the part that you grabbed out of the bin, matching it with another part, they would all fit together. And this allows industry and manufacturing to just absolutely explode. Like I said, this is the way that literally every single thing that is not bespoke made on this planet is made. It allows for the speedy manufacture of every single thing that is in your house, basically. It is the way that the world works now. The idea of tolerance to parts starts right here with Eli Whitney. I could do a whole episode on how important this is. I can't get over it. I remember learning about this for the first time as a kid and just being absolutely blown away. And I still am, clearly, as an adult. Anyways, before I go on a tangent, let's move forward. Like I said, this is gonna set the stage for the Industrial Revolution. This is a huge deal. It begins on a global scale in the 1700s. It starts in Britain, and they have a non-trivial head start on the United States. What they start with are new mechanical ways of spinning and weaving cotton. Basically, the industrialized clothing wear factory system starts in Britain, and that's what begins the Industrial Revolution. And really early on, the Brits have a monopoly on this because their laws wouldn't let them export the machinery or license the machinery or even the patents. Wouldn't allow for it. So they have a monopoly on this for a while. When it does get to the U.S., it gets there in 1789 when a guy named Sam Slater crosses the Atlantic. And there is a drawing of him on the right. He was a textile apprentice, and he didn't come over with a set of plans. He didn't come over with a set of machinery. He came over with his brain. He had memorized all of the details of the textile machinery, and he got over here and reverse engineered them from memory. And it is this technique of mass producing textiles that is applied to basically all consumer goods. It is this mass production method that that gets applied to everything else, and starts a revolution of a product-based industry. And the idea that you can go to a store and buy a thing that was not made locally starts right here. So what this is, instead of people making stuff, it's machines making stuff, factories making stuff. Instead of an artisan sitting down and making a chair, it's an assembly line for, one assembly line is for chair legs, and one is for the back, and one is for the seat, and they all get assembled at the end, that kind of thing. Think very early rudimentary forms of what would come along with Henry Ford. Not quite as organized, but the same idea and goals. This is going to range from everything from simple machines, just spinners, to complex machines that did several tasks. This is going to allow things, think about it, again, back to the chair maker. As soon as everybody in his town's got a chair, that guy's kind of out of business until people start breaking chairs. This allows him to make chairs at such a massive quantity and for so cheap that he can afford to ship them to other places. So now you have a much wider range of distribution of products. And like I alluded to in the past couple of episodes, a lot of this is going to take root in the North. The industrial power in the United States is going to be rooted in the North for arguably even up until, just a couple of decades ago, but certainly up until World War II, at the very least. And a lot of these factories are going to take advantage of water power. So if you remember back to one of our first episodes, I said the reason that Springfield, Massachusetts got set up where it is, why Springfield is Springfield, it's because that's as far as you can sail up the Connecticut River effectively. And a lot of these factories are going to get set up on those same rivers that those first major cities get set up in because of the water power. While all of this is happening in the North, though, the South is very much staying farm-based, agricultural, staying true to that Jeffersonian plan. And in the North, while all of this is happening, because so many people are attracted to this factory work, because there is so much going on, we get this divide that we talked about is growing more and more. So those people who didn't disagree with Jefferson, those who were the Federalists that wanted a strong government and a strong merchant economy, a commerce economy, they are going to favor the North. This is where, free enterprise, this is where like true capitalism comes to be. Well, I wouldn't say comes to be, but certainly takes root very hard. And the idea of kind of the modern style of economy is planted right here. Yeah, that's all we'll say about that for now. Moving on, this is going to lead into some disputes. Not everybody's going to be happy about this. So labor unions get their start here. We're going to talk about a couple of strikes. A labor union in general, just people coming together to fight for improved something. It's not always the same thing. Sometimes it's wages, sometimes it's conditions, sometimes they want rights, sometimes they want XYZ. It's a group of workers coming together to fight for some sort of benefit on their behalf. Now, at the time, a lot of employers don't care and don't even recognize these unions. They don't care so much about these people's rights that they hire people to go break up these unions. This is an actual job. For a long time, they were called strike breakers. And they were employees whose job it was to go basically beat up and otherwise cause violence to people who were striking, or whatever union was coming together. They were there to go break it up. They used firearms. They used clubs and their fists and any manner of violence you can think of. They used to break up these strikes and these unions. And unfortunately for the workers, the courts didn't really care. They basically almost always sided with the companies because the companies had the money they were putting into the economy. And if these people were on strike, well, who cares? They'll just hire more people. It doesn't really matter at this particular period in time. Cotton, slavery, how is that moving forward with the invention of things like the cotton gin? Like I said, the demand for slaves explodes. And like we talked about a couple of episodes ago, despite that explosion of demand, remember, the conversation of emancipation and manumission has already been started. The founding fathers, the people in charge, understand that there is a great hypocrisy here, and they are trying not to have it explode the way that the demand says it should. So in 1808, the government outlaws the importation of slaves. However, it didn't change anything about birthrights for black children born of slave parents. If somebody was enslaved and had a child, that child was the property of the slave owner. So despite importation being outlawed, the birth rate among enslaved women didn't go down. If anything, it grew. And the amount of enslaved people between the invention of the cotton gin in the early 1800s and the start of the Civil War in 1861, the amount of enslaved people in the U.S. quintupled. That means it increased by 5 times. Think on that for a while. Let's talk about who owned slaves, the kind of people who did, and some misconceptions that a lot of Americans have about this period in time. Despite that number of slaves, which is almost unfathomable, only about 5% of Southern households owned slaves. It was a very small number of people who owned a lot of slaves and a lot of land that were pushing for this kind of things. They were wealthy and owned usually several plantations on several large swaths of land. The vast majority of white people in the South during this time period were referred to as yeomen, which was simply a person who owned land, and that was a farmer that didn't own slaves. So I don't want people to think that the majority of people in the South owned slaves, regardless of the fact that very shortly here we're going to have a war about and having to do with slavery. So I know those two things kind of seem at odds with one another, and we'll talk about how and why that happens later. But the vast majority of Southerners did not own slaves. I have a YouTube video here from the movie Django. Go watch it. It's a great movie. It's a good scene. It's a very powerful scene. It can be very hard to watch. I have it in here because of those things. It's the scene where Brunhilde is whipped, and it shows the kind of condition that slaves were in and kept and treated at this time. So viewer discretion advised. It is very graphic. It can be hard to watch, but it's in here for educational purposes. You know, Tarantino overdoes a lot of things, but I don't think that scene is that outlandish, to be honest with you. Anyways, moving forward. Why cotton? At this point in history and for a long time in the South, cotton is going to be the United States' #1 export. It is the #1 cash crop, beating out even, corn that we talked about was making whiskey, sugar that we talked about was making rum, tobacco, it's going to beat all those things out. The largest buyer of American cotton is Britain, and I'm going to need you, my dear listener, to keep this in mind as we move forward. Keep it in mind as we talk about the Civil War, and also keep it in mind as we do a section on Texas. Keep in mind that Britain is the largest buyer of American cotton. Okay? That said, the cotton industry is growing. We said that, the cotton gin exploded the demand for slavery. That means the industry as a whole is growing. So if that is growing, we need more places to grow it. We're going to grow it in more states. So it was a traditional, Southern aristocratic kind of crop, and eventually it goes to everybody. It expands to the yeomen. All of those things is going to get grown in Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, all of those things. Specifically, actually, those three states, Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas, they all got enough people to apply for statehood because of farmers moving there to farm cotton. Texas is going to be similar in that it's going to be a massive exporter of cotton. So much so it's going to be the largest supplier of cotton around the globe for a very, very long time. And I know we talked with those were all basically southern states, but the vast majority of cotton is processed in the north. So it's picked and cleaned, that kind of thing in the south, and then it's shipped up north to be processed, where all of that industry and those factories, where all of that kind of thing is growing. So there's kind of a symbiotic relationship right now between the north and the south. In terms of cotton, it's making basically everybody money, which is a win-win-win. The one group who is not making money is of slaves, of course. And a question that I got over and over and over again when I was teaching is, did slaves fight back? Um, yes, yes, they did. Every time there has been slavery anywhere in the world, slaves did fight back. It is part of human nature to do that. I think it's just kind of ingrained that, you know, put a group of people in an oppressive state for long enough, and some of them are going to fight back. I think it's almost inevitable. Of course, that's a vast generalization. Anyways, how did they do so? There was literal fighting, but a lot of slaves, they did smaller things that we're also going to see the Jews do in concentration camps in the forced work areas there, in those factories. So they're going to do sabotage. They're going to break tools. They're going to organize work. Slowdowns, not quite shutdowns, but slowdowns, so that everybody is working slower. So maybe it's not quite as noticeable by contrast, but less is getting done. And all the way up to including violence and arson and burning down houses and buildings and things. Murder in some cases to try to escape. Nothing on a very large scale in the United States. All attempted rebellions were put down in the U.S. However, Nat Turner in 1831 did lead a group of slaves who murdered a bunch of white people in a rebellion. A thing I have thoughts on here written down, literally the word thoughts, basically as a discussion that I used to like to have with my students, and I'll pose it here too. So let me know in the comments what you think. But so this group of, I forget exactly how many slaves, but they escape, they get arms, and they start a rebellion. And in this rebellion, a bunch of white people are killed, and 50 of those white people are women and children. And I used to just have my students, and I never told them right, wrong, or indifferent. I just had them explain and debate and lay out their feelings on this topic. You know, is it justified? Is it worth these people over here dying for these people to be free? You know, is it kind of a life for a life kind of thing? What do you think? I'm not going to share my thoughts one way or another. I'm happy to discuss it in the comments. Let me know what you guys think. I think this could be a very interesting and deep conversation, provided we keep it civil down there. I also have a bullet here for Haiti. There are not a lot of successful slave revolts in human history that we know of. One of really the only ones that we know was a massive revolt in Haiti that resulted in not only the general people there gaining their freedom, but also Haiti getting its freedom from France. Another very long story that could be covered in a video if you wanted. But I just thought that I'd toss that in there because I thought that was a cool fact and something that kind of connected in terms of rebellions. The nation is growing. We talked about before the idea of slavery and manumission and emancipation is being talked about. And we also talked about the idea of states being divided. They're going to be divided on this topic too. I'm sure you saw this coming. You know we have a civil war. But it starts pretty early on. There are free states and slave states, and the westward expansion is going to complicate that. So more and more states are joining the Union, and neither side wants to be outnumbered. You know, nobody wants to be on the side that the new state entering isn't on, because then you're outnumbered by at least one, if not two. It gets a little complicated. Like we talked about before with the cotton gin and stuff, the South's economy is almost entirely dependent on slave labor. Yes, the South is exporting other stuff, but it's almost to the point where they have a mono economy based on cotton. And because of that, and because the North's manufacturing economy is so ingrained in manufacturing the South's cotton, the North is also reliant on slave labor, albeit indirectly. So it affects everybody. The Northwest Ordinance, if you remember that, basically said all of those states were going to be entered to the Union as free states. Is this precedent a precedent that should still be followed as the United States moved forward in, the mid-1830s and such? That said, the other side of that is like, well, if the plantation system and this quasi-mono economy of cotton is providing such a large portion of economic growth in the United States, well, can the country even afford to outlaw slavery in these new states if so much of this is dependent on slave labor and their cultivating of cotton? These are the kinds of thoughts that are happening as we move forward. And they lead to things sort of like the Missouri Compromise. And we're going to see this modified and expanded later, but it begins here in 1820. Missouri gets admitted to the Union as a slave state, and Maine, which used to be a part of Massachusetts, gets broken off and admitted as a free state. So they kind of balance each other out. They're the two that are in they have the hash patterns on the map. And this is going to set a precedent that states are to be admitted to the Union in pairs, one slave state and one free state, so that neither side is ever at a disadvantage or an advantage. This is going to be the case for the next 20-ish years, maybe a little bit less. Like I said, this starts in 1820. I want you to keep this in mind when we talk about Texas. The antebellum period is going to have kind of its own section, but it's coming up here pretty close. Keep that in mind for when we talk about it. The Missouri Compromise is going to come up several more times. If you look here on the map, the Missouri Compromise line basically sets what is later called the Mason-Dixon line. If you're a state above that line, you are to be admitted as a free state. If you're a state below that line, you have to be admitted as a slave state. The extent to which that is followed varies. Sometimes the government cared about it, sometimes they didn't. The first one that they admitted, both of them are above that line. Its importance is sort of null, but it's important to know that they did talk about it and it was there. And this is where we're going to stop for now. We are going to talk about Texas. We're going to talk about how it gets admitted, how things get complicated really fast, despite this precedent being set. So if you look at the map, the states that are outlined that have the little triangles in them are part of the United States territories. There are people there. Most of them by 1820 have applied for statehood but not have been granted statehood. Things are coming. They're going to come to a head really fast. So if you are following this series in order, keep in mind the Missouri Compromise for the next episode that we talk about. Other than that, thanks for coming out. I appreciate you listening. And if there's anything you guys want changed, started, do you have a video idea on X, Y, Z? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for coming out, and I'll see you in the next one.